Good morning, everybody. We are back in it today for the part 2 installment definitive analysis of Frederik Pohl's The Kindly Isle. If you haven't caught the first video, make sure you're checking that out so that you can see how the story's developed so far, the important themes, the variety of themes that we've discussed so far, and kind of the evidence as well. We're going to get right into it. We're going to move forward. This begins part 3 in the story. And the first thing we notice is Ildo, the boat captain, is serving them lobster. And again, there's that big science fiction element that kind of weaves its way through the story. I guess it's subtle, but if you're really seeing how often we hear about lobster versus perhaps other food, then you can see it actually does kind of come up quite a bit. And so here we are eating lobster. A lot of this, it becomes clear exactly what's going on, so there's no need for me to really say anything beyond just the fact that it is important to notice that they're eating these lobsters. And maybe the final thing I can say quickly is, which means that the lobsters have to do with an association of what the name Ildo means, which is to fight a battle. We've talked about the application of what that could be. To fight a battle, the Cold War makes perfect sense, the United States, USSR, but it's also a battle in your mind, overcoming some obstacle. So I think it's more of that internal conflict that we have for Jerry. All right, a lot of Jerry's old job with the government starts to surface here. And there's another theme of the story that we haven't talked about yet. It's connected to other themes that we have, and that's going to be transparency, right? Opening yourself up to other people, allowing them to understand your problems, your experiences. So far we have Edna. She's opened up a little bit about her domestic abuse and the background there. And Jerry's here, he's not opening up to Edna, but he is opening up to the reader, right? Which of course is the most important audience of all, right? So we're starting to find out more about bacteriological warfare. And it's not just missiles and other ways of fighting and constructing weapons. It's also going to be on a bacterial level, viruses, these governments, these superpowers, they are involved in this as well. This is something that they pursue, which seems like a pretty crooked agenda, an unfortunate agenda, right, where we seek to develop weapons that will harm other nations. But that is the world, unfortunately, that we are caught up in. This is the job that Michaelis, we find out, walked away from, even before Jerry. He was involved with other aspects of it. Jerry is the financial guy, as we know, but he walked away first. It took Jerry a little bit more time to be able to do so, right? We get a line here in the paragraph that provides more information on how Michaelis walked away. And it says that when Michaelis just abruptly left his job, working on these bacteriological and viral weapons, right? He left with the blessing of the establishment. What we have here is sarcasm, right? He didn't, it's sarcasm once we start to think that blessing, in terms of the biblical motifs that we've covered so far, has a very positive meaning. But when we're talking about the US government and this idea of creating weapons through viruses and bacteria, right, that doesn't sound like an institution that should be providing blessings. So we see the irony here, right? We see the sarcasm that's implied. But I think it's also to remind us of the more positive institutions in the world, right? There's government, and then of course there are religious institutions as well. In some parts of the world, these things are blended, hand in hand, theocracies. In some parts of the world, not so much, right? But we can consider them, I think, this story is helping us to see this as two separate institutions. There's religious institutions, their ideas, their practices, there is government, right, as well. All right. A little bit more detail we find out about Michaelis in the old government job in this lab was the work he was working on got outmoded, right? I mean, it just kind of got phased out over time, right? When it's all said and done, and I'm no scientist by any means. I don't know a lot about this stuff. I know what I read, and I'm thankful a little bit for the exposition that's given here, some of the background information on this stuff. What we have is oncoviruses, right? Ones that seem to cause leukemia, all right? Then there was a type D that worked on monkeys, apes, and human beings. That's what Michaelis was working on a virus that could be carried through, I'll read it one more time, monkeys, apes, and human beings. So those particular species. That makes sense on a religious biblical motif, because we know that if Vel Michaelis is considered something strongly associated with God, just look at the name Valiant, power stronger than God, fighting in God's favor, right? If those are the things that name is associated with, then it makes sense that the scientist here, Vel Michaelis, would work on things that affect those particular species, especially human beings, which is really, as we can say, one of the only species that engages in religious thought, psychological thought, right, philosophical thought, where many species, as you can guess, don't do that, right? So it makes perfect sense that Vel was working on that. And then we get that term again, the Substantia Nigra, right, which is the part of the brain, once again, that deals with movement, everyday kind of movement, as well as reward, how we react to reward. And we talked about this in the last lecture, the last analysis. So if you missed it, please, by all means, backtrack, check it out. A9 cells, A10 cells. There could be further play on numerology here, but it is also quite literal, right, in terms of the kinds of cells that we have in the body, right, A9, A10, and he provides a little bit of information on that. We'll see that in practice. We'll see something in action that'll really show what he's talking about here actually take place, right? We'll see how the A9 and the A10 cells react. Now, we get to it, it's all by itself, a single paragraph, schizophrenia. That's what they wanted to produce through the use of bacteriological warfare. They wanted to produce schizophrenic characteristics in a population of another country, right? Turn them into schizophrenic, start to almost kind of spread it through their population, right? So that it could be disrupted from the inside, right? Which is what sometimes governments seek to do, is to cause that internal disruption from the inside and let it kind of, you know, be a major hindrance to the government of that country. He says it quite clearly here to the reader, of course, this kind of internal dialogue that we, monologue that we get with Jerry. I left the library that day convinced that I was helping people develop a virus that would turn normal people into psychotics. So there's where we find out, I think, part of the guilt. Remember we said there's guilt with his, there's going to be some guilt with Marge, right? His old wife, right? His dead wife. We'll find out more. But I think we're starting to actually find out, even before that, the guilt that's involved with his government job that he worked on. We see that it affected Vel Michaelis to the point where he had to walk away from the work, and it's obviously creating a similar internal conflict in Jerry, our narrator. Last thing I'll say here, psychotics. If we break that into a little detail, and I tend to repeat these a lot when I teach this story with my students, what are we really talking about? Just the idea of the characteristics of being angry, tense, and irresponsible, right? Angry, tense, and irresponsible, right? That's what they were trying to produce with this virus, right, and affect populations. We find out that the way of spreading this virus that the U.S. lab has, that they worked for, the way to spread it, of course, was through mammals, right? Or something closely related like marsupials, right? Which I think are like kangaroos, platypuses is what we get here. And there's something just a bit impossible and ridiculous about releasing those types of animals onto a large population of a huge country and expecting the virus to spread. Those are just not the carriers. So there's part of the mystery. If this weapon does get created, right, if this was really followed through and Vale Michaelis was continuing to work on this virus, how was he going to spread it? And at this point in the story, a little after the halfway point, that's going to be a mystery for us, all right? You already might be, if you're tracking everything, the motifs, what we've come across, you probably already got some ideas in your mind. Last thing here before the section break, and nobody had seen Vale Michaelis again until I did, from Dick Cavalin's sob. So I hadn't noticed Vale Michaelis, which is to say this government lab worker who walked away from a job because he didn't like the work he was doing against other people, right? He didn't like the quality of that work, the fact that there was no quality to that work. So he walked away from it. And Jerry hadn't seen him, which is figuratively speaking, to say he hadn't even thought of the idea of this man and his guilt and the tense situation of walking away from a government job, just to go AWOL, which is essentially what happens with Vale. He just never to be seen again. So it's to say, like, you know, to even think about that whole dilemma. He hadn't noticed Dick Cavalin until he was in, he hadn't noticed Vale Michaelis until he was in Cavalin's sob, which means I didn't even think about that person and their conflict and their dilemma until I was in a similar emotional state in the sob with Cavalin, a poet, somebody who's sensitive to other people's conflicts, guilt, grief, remorse, regret, etc., etc. Right? It's all beautiful the way you can look at this figuratively, right? All right. And we find out that as Jerry is the money man of the lab, Vale Michaelis will be the biologist. He knows how everything actually works. Which again, if you're looking at Vale Michaelis as a metaphor for this kind of monolithic God, I think that's fine too, right? All right, as the next section begins, we get a quick reference to what they're eating with Ildo, right, on this boat. Again, Ildo meaning to fight a battle, to try to overcome something. I think that's one way of understanding it. And they're served food on china plates. I know as a kid we had chinaware, and we never really used it. A little bit of chinaware we had. But I think, again, just like we had the Cuban cigars, this is yet another subtle link tying us to a communist country, especially of that time. China, obviously, still today. But reminding us of not only countries, but different economic systems. Whereas we have Jerry engulfed in capitalism, fighting for that in a government lab and trying to keep that way of life alive, there are other systems in place in other parts of the country, which must be a very different life indeed when we talk about the impact of money and the persuasion and what kind of reward that provides us at all times. Why do you do what you do? I think for many of us, especially you ask older folk who are working in such or looking for work, it's the money, right? Why do we do what we do? It's the money. Jerry is, without going into too much detail, he's really enjoying his time with Edna. In fact, it even says the pleasure of Edna's company, and we know Edna is a direct translation to pleasure. So it's really to emphasize the pleasure that's taking place here. People who have gone through so much pain, grief, and now they're enjoying themselves again. Again, these 40-somethings who are on this kind of half work, half kind of personal fun vacation, it seems, because Jerry's also always getting work done too, looking at the hotel and stuff. This is a man who lost his wife 8 years ago and has had a very hard time getting over her. He's thinking about Marge. Remember, the translation of Marge is child of light. The most important Marge we know from our generation, at least mine I speak to, is probably Marge Simpson. Marge is an older name. They don't really use it. It was like 1940s, 1950s, I think it was popular. It's definitely fell off since then. I don't think you see a lot of Marges these days. But let's get back to the translation. Child of light, the beginnings of light. So we get back to that idea of a Garden of Eden, right? And the idea of hope and optimism and new beginnings. To further validate that, it all seemed rosy. Rose as in to grow, right? There was growth before, of course, she died. He says it would have been perfection, a state of perfection, right? Jerry, again, a lot of internal monologue that just really opens up a lot of clear feelings at this point in the story about how he feels to the reader. Lucky us, we're always finding out. He says, it was not a habit of mine to want that kind of intimacy from another person. And I think that makes perfect sense to us at this time in the story, right? We can tell he's not the type to open himself up to other people, his issues. What he rather does is he gets emotional about it, but it's always behind closed doors. I go back to like crying in the hotel room or his bedroom before this trip, one night out of every 3 nights. It goes back to letting the sob out of the parking space. That parking space is your own kind of personal space, but you got to come out of it. It's one thing to grieve in solitude and cry and go through it. It's another thing to open up and share that with somebody. It will definitely have a different impact, right? So definitely wanted to mention that detail. Jerry's not used to it. He's not used to getting this kind of intimacy, right? All right. Toward the end of this section, right? Toward the end of this section, I think that the only really super important thing that I'd like to point out is we find out that Vale has left, Vale Michaelis, knows that Jerry's on this island, and he knows Edna. We know they've known each other for a while, which of course is all very symbolic and, you know, kind of represents the fusion of ideas more than people. But he says, I'll just read, I thought I'd better leave while Gerald was still wrestling with his conscience. And so he took off because he didn't want to bug Gerald, right? And he says, thank you for letting me use his space. And his space at this point in the story is definitely a pretty big mystery. The answer is given to us later on. We will get there. But at this point, that's definitely, I just wanted to mention, a big mystery. What does he mean by space? That's so strange. What does he mean? We'll see. The thing I want to focus on here is the formal addressing of Jerry. Jerry is the informal variant of Gerald, G-E-R-A-L-D. And I love this name symbolism. What does Gerald translate to? Ruler of the spear, to rule by spear. Ruler of the spear, I think, is kind of those translations, meaning to rule by force. Don't forget, I've watched a few YouTube, a lot of good history stuff. I battle with the way it's presented at times. Is it really the most effective? But really good stuff. We learned that the spear was really one of the first weapons of soldiers, right? I think even if you go back to the Romans, it was a spear. It really, you didn't see a lot of people using swords. It was more spears. It was more built for military combat. So this name represents a person who rules by force, rules through military means. And that makes sense for Jerry because of his job with the government creating weapons. So I love it. We have our main character here, Gerald, Jerry, and now we know the name means so much more. It's like war and rule by force on a totally thematic level at this point, and we can see how this plays out. Interesting now, we recognize that Gerald, rule by spear, is now coupled up with Edna, which represents rejuvenation. You may ask, well, what do we make of that union? To rejuvenate what? To rejuvenate something about that disposition of warlike mentality? I don't know. Let's keep on going into the next section. All right. Now this, I definitely feel like we do get a title reference, always so nice. It says, I'd met, nearly everyone I'd met on the island was as kindly as the island claimed. So we are on the kindly isle. That single characteristic of being kind, so easily contrasted with the characteristics of cruelty, greed, obsession, whatever it's going to be, aggressiveness, right, which leads to a kind of friction, right? This is a kind island, but Jerry's confused. He thinks that Vale is still working on a virus to make people angry, irresponsible, intense. We go back to those 3 words given to us earlier, right? So I just want to make that clear. That's what he thinks Vale is up to. We will have to wait and see. He takes it for granted that he's going to have dinner with Edna. That's a nice, I like that line because it's really about relationships that we have. Like it does. When you start to have a long-term relationship, it does get to that point, whether quickly or down the road, where you don't have to, you take getting together for dinner for granted. It's not something you get you get excited about it, you're happy about it, but it's not like the first date where you don't know if the second date's going to happen, or the third or the fourth, right? So there's this relaxed feeling, and that must feel good for both of these individuals, Jerry and Edna, right, as they get closer together. They know they're going to be together. That's nice. He's creating space. It's not like, oh, do I really want a person in my life or not? We know this is probably something he struggled with. It's kind of just happening now. He's feeling, as he says here, almost at peace. Peace and rest obviously has kind of biblical overtones, so I think it's further playing upon that. Now, he says to Edna, "This is really nice, Marge," he said, accepting a refill in his glass. Now, there's a couple things here. I'll start with the first one. The number one, as no matter what you do, never tell or call your romantic interest the name of another person. And that's just what he did, right? Instead of addressing her by Edna, her name, he said Marge. And, I feel like that's a big no-no. But at the same time, I like to stop here and say, well, is that a bad thing? And start to engage with students. And a lot, we'll quickly come to the idea that maybe not. When we think about Marge being child of light, Edna being rejuvenation, it really symbolically is just an extension of that light. Here we go. He's moving forward with that. Also, as students will share, really good idea, maybe it just shows a certain comfort. He treasured Marge. Why wouldn't he? He said it was perfect. Everything was perfect. So maybe it's not such a bad thing if he felt those kinds of feelings about her, to now pass those on, or in some way they translate to Edna. Luckily, Edna is not taken back by it. She's not angered by it, right? She understands. She says, like we had just mentioned, it's probably a compliment. So maybe we've passed a little bit of a threshold here where there is this rejuvenation in Jerry to be able to hold hands with another person here, a new person in his life, and move forward, right? Still with those feelings of love and comfort and ease and peace in his mind, he can now move forward. And we know she needs it too. Edna, literally in the story, is dealing with domestic abuse. We know she needs rest as well. Right? She needs a big change. She reaches out to touch his hand. Notice, go back to the Substantia Nigra. It deals with movement. Sometimes you just know, I have two boys, if they call out and they cry or whatever, I know I have to do something. I have to maybe reach out. I have to hold them. I have to comfort them. That maybe is just in my brain. Maybe that's the Substantia Nigra that's helping me process what I need to do, right? Just general movement. She does that here. She reaches out to touch his hand. He's in a lot of grief, right? And then the whole thing came out. And as she finds out, we find out as readers about the shark attack and the way Marge died, right? And he feels guilty for this because he feels like he could have watched her, he could have monitored, he could have been there to help her, right? But it all happened and she seemed to be too far away, and how are you going to survive an attack like that once it's taking place, right? He says he didn't tell her the whole thing. This just comes to mind right now. There is the motif of the moon in this story. He cries under a half moon. Here we have a half moon bite, chomp, taken out of the surfboard. It's told to be in the shape of a half moon. Here we have a whole thing. So that could be a contrast there, right? So not the whole thing. He's not going to tell her the whole thing. But he does share enough so that she knows how his wife died, right? Here he says, and this is just picking up on an idea we talked about earlier. He says, I'd done a lot of weeping in 8 years, but never once in the presence of another human being. There's a difference. letting that sob out of the cramped parking lot. There's a difference between crying by yourself and then crying with somebody else. That's why people need their therapy and their counseling and their psychiatry. So that there's a lot, I think if they make you cry, it's like, it's a good thing, right? Because it's kind of an outpour of emotions or some kind of stress that just needed to happen. But to do it in front of someone else is much different than to do it in front of just on your own in solitude. We move on to section 4. All right. So they're in the airport getting ready to leave the island. The trip is over. His business is done. The acquisition's been has taken place. There is this lingering mystery of Michaelis. Where did he disappear to? In Jerry's mind, he still thinks he could be working on that awful virus to make people have schizophrenic qualities, angry, tense, irresponsible, right? All right, so they're getting ready to leave. They're at the airport. And this is a small island airport. I've been on one in Hawaii before, and on the island of Kauai, and the Big Island, but the one on Kauai was definitely tiny. And they're very small. I guess they can be very crowded, right? Everybody packed in like sardines, as the expression goes. One thing we find out is that they both live in Washington, D.C. I think this is very important, metaphorically speaking, because it shows that rejuvenation, what Edna represents, was always close by to Jerry. It took him a lot of time to find it. He had to go off to this island, get involved in this whole kind of search for Vale. Look at this hotel, which is really metaphorically introspecting on his mind. And now he realizes she's right there. She's been there all along. Rejuvenation for all of us is always close by. I think it's more of a mentality. Are you there in your life? Are you ready for it? Now, here's a wonderful use of microcosm, macrocosm. And I'll be quick about it. The microcosm is the airport, the small island airport. Everyone's pushed together. Ooh. Right? You would think that everyone would be straight miserable, right? Everyone would be miserable. But I want to mention this key sentence. The tiny terminal was steamy with human bodies, but it almost seemed they didn't even sweat. So somehow, some way, these people getting ready to leave the island, it's a tense situation, packed in like this, but if they're not letting it bother them, they're not even sweating. Now we get into some major biblical themes. Sins of the flesh, right? What makes us human? The body. The fact that I sweat, the fact that I have pain, the fact that we die, all of these things that come with the human experience. And I think the needs of the body, the wants of the body, the trying to satiate what the body craves, that's where we lead to aggression and overstepping and expansion, imperialism, colonialism, so much. I saw somebody say recently, just a few days ago, you want to understand racism in any country, in any continent, you have to go back to colonialism. When one group came and established power and dominance over another through all kinds of means. Not just one or two, all kinds of means. So this is the human experience. To be in a cramped place, Earth, with limited resources. And what do we do when we're in those? Read Darwinian theory. We're in that old survival of the fittest. A lot of people take that out of context. If there's plenty of resources, Darwin says, species get along all the time. There's tons of cooperation if resources are abundant. It's when there's a scarcity, packed on Earth, only so much to go around, that's when we start to resort to different means, right? Aggressiveness, taking over territory, etc., right? But something's happened for these people on this island as they get ready to leave, that they're not contentious. They're not angry, right? Or tense in this situation. All right, even Edna's sister, Lucille, and brother-in-law, even light, and then as we said before, the reddish, hellish qualities that we find, that doesn't, it sounds severe, but that is just sin, right? That is the six in us, the beast, that which cannot be contained by some more moral and ethical guidelines, which throughout time religion has proclaimed itself to do, right? to provide more of that moral and ethical line that we must abide to, despite our need to be beasts, right? As the world gives us many, many examples. So even they are getting along. The light is blending with the hellishness in us. Maybe it's there to mend. Maybe it's there to rejuvenate. Maybe it's there to change, mediate. But the light is there with the red, right? With that hellishness. That state that maybe a lot of people find themselves in. Here on Earth. Here on Earth. So the microcosm is this little tiny airport. The macro is Earth itself, and everybody being here and trying to get along despite the circumstances we find ourselves in. All right? Going down, just to give every little detail, I won't say anything about it, but we do have a DC-10 aircraft. Maybe remember earlier we talked about A-10 cells. I think the number 10, if you're looking at more numerology in this story, the number 10 is really all over the place, right? He's still of the mindset at the end of this section that Vale Michaelis might be spreading a horrible virus around the island. He's still of that mentality, and that's what drives him to say, I'm not going home yet, and he says goodbye to Edna here. They'll meet again. He's got to go find Vale Michaelis, find out exactly what he's up to, so that he can feel better about the situation, so he can find some closure here. So in a way, for Jerry, the personal relationship and getting over Marge, I think we found some remedy to that. I do think we found some resolution, it's here, to that loss. But now there is the guilt from the government job. Purposefully hurting people, and now having to find the source of that, Vale Michaelis, and trying to make sure it doesn't happen, that he can't follow through with this plan. But he notices this is the kindly isle. Everyone, from Deirdre, all the way through Cavelin, Edna, Ildo. This is a great place, right? All right. Now enter Joe Mooney and his associate from the National Security Agency, the NSA. Here we go. The name Joe Mooney. Remember the motif of the moon? Most notably, again, crying under the half moon in the surfboard, which really is, indicative of the horrible death of Marge, right? The shark accident. Oh, let me mention again, shark. Can't pass this by. Remember we had the dolphin statue early on? We've mentioned sharks here and there, but now we know it's a shark attack, predator. Those key characteristics which establish who we are as people. Are you the prey? Are you the predator? We know what it means to the animal kingdom. You can't ignore it in the animal kingdom. But people, maybe through religion, have a different chance. Right? And that's the idea. That's that big biblical motif. We are beasts. We are those sharks. Right? Do you know a shark? In terms of somebody and how you would explain them, their characteristics, how they treat other people? So there it is. And it led to the death of light. The beginnings of light was ended by a predator, which is to say, in the biblical sense, all hope was lost by greed and lust, right? And the things we think we need more of. So you can see that strong motif. Back to the NSA. Now, it was about as much of an invitation as a draft notice is what he says here, right? So they just pull them, they pull up and they say, you're coming with us, you're going to help us find Vale Michaelis. They too want to find out what this guy's been up to. But he says, they pulled me as quick as, it was just as nice as a draft notice, right? So he's being very sarcastic here. It was very harsh of them to do this. But we do get this reference to a draft notice. What's a draft notice? I think this for young people nowadays has to be explained. My generation, I think, knew what a draft notice was, but I think younger people, you got to explain it. We go back to Vietnam. That's the most recent conflict where you were, as a young man, at the age of 18, you were forced to put your name on a list. This is true of girls nowadays. When they turn 18, they have to put their name on a list. I think they changed the rules, which means that if the country ever needs you to go fight in a war, they can do it. They can force you to fight in a war, force you to go kill, force you to provide any kind of role in that, and in a way force you to die, right, as you get put on the front line in some of these conflicts. So that's what a draft is. Now we have something that's always important to note here. There's something called conscientious objector. And this was a status that you could claim in Vietnam, in World War II, in World War I, but it would be very difficult for them to approve this. You have to really have a good, some pieces of evidence that show that you are a conscientious objector. For instance, you're a priest, right? Your name comes up to go fight, and you happen to be a practicing preacher or a priest, and it goes against your moral and ethical code, whatever it might be, that might work. But if you're just some random guy who's like, oh, I just don't like killing people, they would still send you, right? So I want to point out that the other side of a draft notice is conscientious objector, and that means you oppose it for moral and ethical reasons, right? And that was hard to do. So why do we have this reference to a draft notice? Think about the countries that are involved in the backdrop in the Cold War, USSR and the United States. Both of these countries definitely had drafts during World War II, World War I, US, Vietnam, Soviet Union. Go look at their conflicts. I'm sure they had drafts going on there too. And it's a big part of how countries wage war. It is the monopoly of violence, as I once heard said in a Professor Ruiz lecture out of UCLA. That governments very early on in the 1450s, 1500s, learned that they could monopolize force and violence and use it to further their own aims as a country, right, as a kind of central state. So that's how countries gain, right, is through the use of draft, and then they can compose and conduct these wars. As they are driving down this rather kind of rustic rural road, he's going so fast, driving so aggressively, Joe Mooney, that they kill a hen. And the narrator says, I think we scored a hen, right? I'm not sure if I mentioned this before, but I want you to notice the tone of how he refers to an animal losing its life. He said this earlier when he was describing some of the background on the weapons that he produced. He said, if you want to kill a lot of people or make them sick, I'll say that again. If you want to make a lot of people sick, then you just got to do this, right? Which shows a certain attitude toward what he's talking about. He's cool with it, right? It kind of comes with the territory, right? There's supposed to be loss and kind of casualty. That's part of the game plan. I work for a government lab that makes weapons. What do you expect my mindset to be? So you can see when he's around these NSA officials, that personality that he's been trying to change through this whole experience on the island and rejuvenate and become something different, it's back. And it's back because of these men, and they are the epitome of that assertiveness, that aggression, that objectivity. There's the word I've been looking for. To objectify a situation, all ethics and morals aside. What do we got to do? Make a lot of people sick. Okay, that's our job. We're going to do it, right? And the morals and ethics seem to slide away and have no bearing. Right, everybody seems to kind of catch up and get on the same page here too. Seeing, Val Michaelis, yeah, we know what this weapon was about. He wanted to make people crazy. What is the NSA worried about? Well, because Val Michaelis disappeared, they're worried that he might have taken the work he was doing, what he had for that weapon, and he might have gone off to the Soviet Union and started and commencing the work with them so that they could use it against the United States. See that level of paranoia, right? The level of paranoia that overcomes these agencies, but it seems like it makes sense in terms of the real harm they seek to do to each other. I mean, if you had real people out to get you every day, real institutions and organizations and governments out there that want to do you harm, it almost makes sense that you're going to have an extreme paranoia, but is that good for us as humanity? Is that good for us as people, right? Joe says to Jerry here, you always were a goo-goo. Here's where I date myself incredibly. And I know I won't be able to get a picture for this, but that's okay. Goo-goo dolls. When I was growing up, the goo-goo dolls were a big deal. And I think they're out of Buffalo, New York. So shouts out to Buffalo. Got some good bands. Good music. I can't say I was a huge fan, but they were definitely a good band, a recognized band. Now, what does it mean to be a goo-goo? Well, it just means to kind of be a baby. To be, in the context that Joe was using it here, he says, you're too soft on Val Michaelis. You should want to get this guy, get him behind bars, he's a traitor. And yet Jerry is, at least from what we have here, a bit more sympathetic to Vale, right? Wanting to at least talk to him, etc., right? And then Joe says, you sure Michaelis didn't stick you with some of the stuff in reverse? Meaning, you sure you didn't get a virus that's making you a nice person instead of the stuff it was supposed to be, which was to make you a bad person? And he says it. We don't get any follow-up on it. This section quickly ends right after that. But it's to bring up this question mark. What kind of virus may be floating around on this island? Did Jerry have some of it? Is that what's allowing him to get over his wife? Is that what's allowing him to now think about Vale Michaelis' situation in a little bit more of an endearing and sensitive way? And therefore how? And it's all given to us, right? As they go back to the hotel. And once again, we're not just going to the three-quarter built hotel. We are going into Jerry's mind. And what we find here, and Jerry couldn't find it, his first few attempts, his first few tours through the hotel, he didn't see it. The NSA guys sniff it out right away. I don't really need to read the language too much here. But what they do find here in just a moment is the wine cellar. All right. Before that, to describe their activity, the NSA agents, I'll give you a couple key words here. Prodding and peering, right? Prodding is to kind of poke, right? You prod cattle, right? Get them to go where you want them to go. You prod prisoners, right? But it means there is an aggressiveness there. There's an assertiveness. You go there, right? And I'm going to prod you and make sure that you do it. Peering, right? That's where we talk about the National Security Agency, being able to read emails, being able to monitor our lives. For Jerry here, they found him in a heartbeat when they needed to, right? They always know where you are, right? And some of this we give into willfully because we just like the technology and what it provides. So is it a trade-off that you agree with, or do you think it's something that we need to be more careful about? But notice those aggressions, those behaviors of government. What do behaviors do? Governments do. They prod into our lives. They peer into our lives. All right, so final thing to say about the prodding and the peering, I think is to just remind us of at least to what we can speak of here in the United States, which is the Patriot Act, what gave the National Security Agency, along with other U.S. intelligence agencies, the rights that they do to prod into our lives and peer into our lives. To be short about it, I will never forget when I was doing some observations of middle school classrooms, because you kind of have to look at a full kind of spectrum of things. I witnessed a social studies teacher who did a great activity where she put all these things on the projector. It was back in the day. And it was like all the things the NSA can do to you because of the Patriot Act. And they can look at what books you check out of the library, phone calls, text messages. Really, it's a vast list of how they can prod and peer into the lives of everyday Americans, especially if you're somebody like Jerry and you have governmental connection. Then it's probably even more of an issue. But I just wanted to mention that, right, to really facilitate a conversation quickly about what it means to be prodded and peered. Look no further than the Patriot Act, which underwent maybe some changes, but definitely some fortifications as legislation's been passed over the years. But it all started with the Patriot Act after 9/11, right? Go back, do your research, start to learn more about it. All right. We find out here at the end, Mooney asked the question, have you heard of any cases of epidemic craziness on the island? And as close readers of this story, we can say, quite contrary, we found epidemic kindness, right? This is the kindly isle. So it speaks to the effect this island has as people come, spend time there, some more than others, but the effect that it's having, turning people into gentler, more open, maybe even more cooperative and more pleasurable kind of lives of human beings here, right? You're seeing it happen on this island. So it's right in the beginning of the next section where Jerry seems to finally put it all together and recognize that lo and behold, what Michaelis has done is, originally, because he was working for a government made of men and women, right, human beings, he was forced to work on a virus that was supposed to have devastating consequences on people because it turned them essentially crazy, right? Schizophrenic kind of characteristics. But what they're recognizing now is we don't have crazy people on this island. He can't be doing this experiment here because we don't have crazy people. What we have is really kind and nice people. And so now we start to realize maybe he has shifted the effect. He's changed the effect. Not to change you into a angry, tense, and irresponsible person, but rather a gentler, kinder, easier person to be around. Remember the microcosm of the airport. Sweaty bodies everywhere and no space and no time, but it's not an issue. Everyone being cooperative and getting along. All right, so he's starting to piece it together here, right? Maybe that's what Michaelis did. He made a virus to make people actually nice. That quickly goes back to that overall theme of, we mentioned it before, who you think we are, human beings. Are we naturally nice and helpful individuals, or are we naturally angry and aggressive individuals, right? Or whatever characteristics you're really looking to contrast there. Who are we naturally? And therefore, that speaks to what kind of fix we are in need of, right? To become better people, gentler people, right? So if that's the case, if he changed it to make people nicer, kinder, like you treat kin, right? That's how those words are connected. Then it says that our original disposition is not so good. Moving forward into the last part here. Also, what we find out here is we know that it couldn't work with mammals and marsupials, the spreading of this virus. They were not conducive carriers, right? So what we do have it working on is crustaceans, shellfish. I personally am allergic to shellfish. I can't eat it. I've had to stay away from it my whole life. The few times I've tried it, definitely had some immediate reaction, so I was smart enough to stop. But I hear that it's good. In this story, though, it became the perfect vessel, right, to carry this virus, especially because people like to eat shellfish. It's a bit inconspicuous. You wouldn't think of it right off the bat that that's the way it was being spread, right? And there it is. We're starting to piece things together. But a virus not to make people angry and hostile, rather kind and considerate. Last part of this story, part 5, we're way back in DC. We are at a elderly and declining hotel, right? And I think this is again, just like the hotel was a metaphor for Jerry's mind, and the wine cellar, let me, before we move on, let me say is probably going to be directly metaphorical for his, the part of the brain, the Substantia Nigra, which is where he needed to make some changes in terms of the reward system that was at play. And that brings you into very interesting conversations about capitalism versus communism and where we find the rewards that keep us going as individuals and as society. That's where we are in the wine cellar. That's where Michaelis was working his experiments, was in that part of his brain, right? Metaphorically and thematically speaking, right? That's where he needed to find changes, and he did. Like I said, with Edna, he definitely seems to have overcome a big hurdle of loss, guilt, and finding somebody to listen to his problems and actually finding some pleasure beyond that, right? Mooney's partner growls, right? I'll just give you some key diction here again, just to showcase the epitome of beast. I think these two people, coming from the NSA, we talked about the assertive nature of these organizations. That's why you have the growling here, a true predator at the end. He says, we'll be watching you, to both, really addressing Jerry, but Edna's with him as well. And there's that peering nature. We're never going to stop watching you. Again, think about the phones. Think about the social networks that we ascribe to, right? There's a lot about privacy rights and all these things. That conversation is way too deep to have right now as we are on the very ends of this story, but think about that, right? The level of monitoring that these organizations have in our lives. I think sometimes the power of this comes from us simply not acknowledging it or even thinking about it or talking about the real power at hand here in terms of companies and government and how they monitor our lives, right? Especially nowadays. This was written, I believe, I've said the 60s, but I actually think it might be the 80s if I'm not mistaken. But you can see we've come out of a Cold War era, and with that is this kind of surveillance state as well. Think about the blacklisting in Hollywood, all that stuff, the Red Scare. I had to always look up, and just did so recently, this last time teaching with my students, we looked up the reference Johnny Happyseed, and you can probably figure it out through the name itself, but seeds of happiness and somebody spreading this, right? It is the second time we've gotten the name John, which is interesting, but if you look it up, it was kind of a more popular culture icon, but in many ways it represents the idea of Jesus, right? Spreading happiness, spreading kindness, whatever it might be. And that's what she says Vale Michaelis is. Now that we know what he's up to, he's not making a virus through the use of Shellfish, right? And what he knows about creating viruses, retroverde. He's not doing it to make people mean, he's doing it to make them kind. This gets into, I like to plug this in at the end, should he be tampering as a doctor? As a human being, should he be tampering with people in this way, making them, even if it's for the better, like you become more kind and cooperative, right, in the world amongst people? Is it his job, his role? Does he have the right to be changing people in this way, altering their genetic kind of coding, right? He's a Johnny Happyseed, he's a Jesus, kind of going around. And I think that's good. You know, we talk about Vale Michaelis, Valiant, you know, power of God, and I think Jesus is closely connected to that as somebody who is said to be, at least through the writings and such, so close to that entity of God, right? So it's pretty much connected here, especially in terms of the number 3, rebirth, the crucifixion, starting over again, right? Getting back to a state of innocence and pleasure, etc., Garden of Eden, all those motifs you can see coming together here. All right, something about the hotel. What is it a metaphor for? He says here, the hotel itself was fine. It was the top management that was incompetent, right? The hotel is fine, it's just the people running it that's the problem. I love to pause here with students, right, and say, well, what could this be an allusion to, right, or a metaphor for? And what we find ourselves eventually getting to is, isn't that the problem? Aren't we speaking to a country? A country being ran badly, just like this hotel restaurant. It's not being run well by management. A country not being run well by its leaders. And that's what we have, right? And again, just kind of a microcosm, macrocosm here at the end, giving us the small hotel that has just bad leadership. What does it make us think of? The world stage, where we have countries that are mishandling situations, being far too assertive with one another, not being diplomatic by any means sometimes, and just getting into a lot of hostile affairs. And who is put in the middle of it? Yes, soldiers, but civilians. You know, when we talk about atomic war or nuclear war, we talk about this Cold War, buildup of atomic nuclear arms, right? It's civilian populations that eventually will be targeted by these things in some way, shape, or form. So it's always regular folk who find themselves as the main loser, especially the poor. That's just kind of a fact that you can look into more and listen to more perspective. The poor suffer the most in war for at least a few reasons, depending on the context that you're looking at. But back to this, that's what we're talking about. A country with bad leaders. How do you feel about the leaders of this country? Do you like the way they handle our global affairs? Do you like the way they handle environmental affairs? That's important, right? It's important to start thinking about that. Here, the social commentary through use of metaphor, this kind of microcosm, is going to be government. Just, it's horrible leadership, right? It's horrible leadership. So we are talking about the country at large, right? And then we find out what Michaelis's plan ends up being. We find out that it's soft shell crab season, going to be a lot of shellfish coming around. Who eats at a lot of these restaurants in and around DC? We also have the Pentagon close by. Don't forget about that. A lot going on in Washington, DC. Here it is, congressmen, senators, diplomats. Diplomats being those people who come from different countries. So even those who come to represent those countries and meet with our leaders, our congressmen as well, our politicians, right? They're the ones who eat at these restaurants. And soft shell crab season is essentially underway, which means these people, the leaders, right? We just talked about the leaders of countries. The leaders will be eating this food and therefore perhaps being put in kinder dispositions. And there's the major plan, especially if you love shellfish. I can't eat it. That makes me remind you, remember on the airplane coming back, Jerry comments, he narrates, that there was an individual who couldn't eat shellfish who was in a bad mood. And that is evidence that it was the shellfish that was being ingested, consumed by so many people. And then it was making them nicer people, right? Kinder people. Just filling this island. And now going back to their notable destination, notable homes, right, where they live. In this case, we're back in Washington, D.C. So that's the plan. And he says here right at the end too, every year we get a series of seminars with Pentagon people, right? This is the concierge of the hotel who's really trying to put on a good face for this hotel because it's another acquisition property for Jerry, right? With his job with his real estate, really trying to put a good face on the hotel. All right, he says we get a lot of people from the Pentagon. Edna drops her fork. Fork is now linked to Jerry's name as rule by spear, rule by force, rule by military means. And notice that Edna, which represents a rejuvenation of light, pleasure in life, drops the fork. Of course. Get the weapon out. You know, she drops the weapon from her hand here, right? And there's what Michaelis is trying to do by spreading this virus to these notable people. Make them drop the weapons. Make them more cooperative. Will we ever get to see a world like this, people? In the year 2021, I speak? I don't know. It could always be with us, this idea of war, right? And constant aggression posed by these superpower nations in the world. And even the less so superpower. You look at North Korea. But they do have the potential for nuclear weapons, which gives the world a reason to pay attention to them, right? Which is essentially what they're looking for. We can see the power of weapons and the way we use these weapons. What if we just got rid of them? It would always take a first country to do that, right? Or a set of countries. The U.S. just pulled out of some of the nuclear kind of reduction deals that we had with the Republic of Russia. We had an agreement, and then I think Trump took us out of those agreements. So now it's back to just everybody improving upon these nuclear technologies. It's not really about quantity anymore like it was in the Cold War. These days, it's more money being put into the level of sophistication, power, etc., I guess, of nuclear bombs. And it's a competition. It's still going. I think Pohl would, if he were here, would recognize, right? This is just still going. In its own way, it's still going. All right. The waiter, a country who represents metaphorically this hotel, which is a country, the United States, quickly puts the fork back in Edna's hand, which is to say that a government wants to always put a weapon in your hand to make you aggressive, especially toward other nations that it deems as opposing, right, or a threat. Look at terrorism. So much of it is the threat of it, right, that keeps us committed to the cause. So quick to put it in your hand. This also is a clear tie to, he didn't put it in here for no reason, the draft. What does a country want to do is, in times of need, put a weapon in your hand and tell you to go fight in their interest, right? Put a fork in your hand. So right as Edna can drop it, boom, picking it back up, right? The story ends, this rather long, beautiful story, ends with them ruminating over Vale Michaelis's next step, who is a kind of, let's say in general at the end here, a combination of the power of God, the symbolism of Christ, this idea of starting over again after doing one bad thing with your work, doing something totally different, right? And they realize, oh, I know where he must be going next. The Kremlin, which is essentially the Washington, D.C., the White House, if you will, of the Republic of Russia, right? Of course, located in Moscow, right? I'd like to go there someday with my family, probably. We'll see how that goes. So there it is. Right now, the Shellfish is being served to these important U.S. leaders as well as diplomats from other regions important to us. We are now going to start to essentially do, Vale Michaelis is going to start to do the same thing over on the eastern seaboard, right? So that the Soviet leaders can start to ingest the lobster and therefore decode, right? To change retroactively their disposition of nastiness and competitiveness and aggressiveness. I'll just keep using that word, of course, as compared to something more cooperative and kind, right? Remember the connection of kind and kin. Kin being your family, your brothers, sisters, right? Those closest to you, and that's who you're kind to, right? But the idea of extending it beyond those people, right, to really people throughout the entire world. John Lennon's Imagine that they play every year, ironically, at when the ball goes down and it's New Year's Eve. It is really about doing away with all national identity, tearing down all boundaries that lead to ideological differences in our mind that make me feel like we don't belong together and should be more competitive with one another as opposed to, working together, right, and having a kinder environment, I guess you could say. That's the way it ends. Looks like Jerry and Edna continue their relationship, which is, I think, a wonderful way of ending it for Jerry on a personal note. And I hope you enjoyed this analysis on this story. I encourage you to go read Gateway. I've mentioned it before. I'll say it one more time. Definitely go read Gateway and maybe the subsequent book. It's a 4-part series. Can't say I enjoyed the last 2 all that much. But the first 2, especially that first one, so engaging, enthralling. Loved it. I just couldn't put it down. I couldn't wait to see what was going to happen to that wonderfully drawn out character that he has in that book. Thank you so much. I hope you have a beautiful day. See you again.